when Picard wakes up in that kind of living room area with Data. My first reaction was just to interpret this as a NDE or an afterlife type experience. We've seen NDEs and afterlife type scenes in Star Trek in various ways. At least they've been alluded to. They've certainly been visualized, where we've seen them happen and we've seen them talked about. But it was never, none of those were actually supposed to have happened in universe, with the exception of Sisko. When Sisko went to be with the prophets at the end of DS9, that happened. But other than that, all the NDE-like experiences didn't tend to be ones that were actually, they happened and they were actually an afterlife that a character actually went to. And some of them, to list some of them, were the TNG episode Tapestry, was where Q pretends to be God, and Picard says, "You're not God. The universe is not so badly designed." So you could say it was an afterlife, but really it was just Q doing his Q things that he does, And we had the DS9 episode where Quark has a dream that he wakes up in the Divine Treasury, and he gets spoken to by the great Ferengi icon Gint, who looks suspiciously like Rom. And when he asks him why he looks like Rom, he says, I think this is the part where he says, "Because you're dreaming, you idiot," or something like that. That was a pretty cool scene. I like that scene. There was the Voyager episode. There were a number of Voyager. There was the Voyager episode where Janeway has an NDE. She's on the planet, and Chakotay's, "Oh, Janeway," this is the one where there's actually an alien masquerading as Janeway's father, trying to lure her into the white light, basically so that he can feed on her disembodied soul for all eternity, or at least for a long time, however long it takes to sustain him and drain her out of it, whatever. And then what was interesting about this one was they kind of ponder near the end of the episode, I wonder if this is just what happens when a lot of people come near death and there are aliens like him kind of lurking like spiders, eating, Then we had the season 7 Voyager episode where B'Elanna thinks that she has arrived at the barge of the dead. And for a lot of the episode, the Watcher is allowed to think that that's what happened as well, but by the end, it seems like it's probably a dream, or at least, at most, some kind of spiritual vision related to a near-death experience. So Star Trek has had NDEs, and it has had afterlives, the afterlife, an afterlife of some kind on the table for discussion. But usually it hasn't, Star Trek hasn't included real ones that were actually supposed to, that's what they are, with the exception of Sisko at the end of DS9 when he went to be with the prophets. So if this was an actual afterlife in which Picard reunites with Data, that would have been a little unusual. Now, I thought it was interesting, though, that Picard isn't particularly surprised to wake up and see Data within this afterlife flavor kind of context. He doesn't seem surprised by that, but he does seem kind of surprised when Data tells him it's a simulation. It's almost like, for all the Starfleet skepticism that characterizes Picard's life, it's almost like there's still some kind of intuition that causes him to not end up feeling surprised that he would experience something after death. And it seems that this particular kind of scene here is the kind of thing that he had been either hoping for, or for some reason he's just not really surprised. I mean, so much so that he wonders if it could be a dream, because he's dreamed about this kind of thing happening. It's interesting that the dream category comes up again, because when I recently rewatched Barge of the Dead from Voyager, I noticed that their main way of painting B'Elanna's NDE was, at the end of the day, it became very dreamlike. And the interpretation that I come away with is that it really would have been some kind of dream, or at most a vision. It's interesting. There's this book I've been reading through about NDEs. It's called Evidence of the Afterlife by Jeffrey Long and Perry Paul. And as they're talking about what their survey-based studies show about commonalities and differences in NDE reports, in what they consider to be credible NDE reports, one thing they say in Chapter 3 is they say one of their surveys, it was a survey of 613 respondents, and they'd included the question, was the experience dreamlike in any way? And then I'm just going to read a section out of the book. It says, that was the question, and it says they allowed only a narrative answer, so there would have been a box, they had to fill in or something like that. And they say the response to the question was generally an adamant no. So they don't give us a number. In most of the book, they'll give you a percent number for each of the answers. They don't give a number. They just say it was generally an adamant no. And then they say, this finding is especially significant given that the wording of the question encouraged a positive response if any part of the NDE was dreamlike, end quote. And then later on, the authors quote Grayson and Kelly No idea who they are, some researchers, I guess. But the authors quote them as saying that in an analysis of 520 cases, quote, 80% of the experiencers described their thinking during the NDEs as clearer than usual or as clear as usual, suggesting a kind of lucidity that wouldn't make as much sense if the NDE is just a dream state from a dying brain. So anyway, just a little aside about some of that, since it's something that stood out to me and kind of relates to the discussion a little bit. And sometimes I like to tie in things that I'm reading, in non-fiction related stuff when they pop out to me. And definitely when you hear NDE stories, which I'm not that into the area there, but I've read enough stories to get the impression sometimes they do sound dreamlike, particularly when you read them and you bump into elements that are just kind of weird, such as one that I read a little bit ago where the experiencer, I think it was in the same book it was the same book that I just mentioned, but there was an NDE they listed where the guy said, he was having tea or coffee with his grandmother, and in the cup of tea or coffee, whatever it was, there was steam coming out of it, but it was lukewarm. So when you read that, and the only framework that I have is that sounds dreamlike to me, because if I saw, steam coming out of something and then I drank it and it was lukewarm, I would have to be in a dream, But apparently, at least for those 613 people, even though it had elements like that in it, it didn't seem dreamlike anyway. So it was kind of interesting to think about. But for Picard here, in this particular case, it's not a dream, nor is it a near-death experience. And the only reason Picard, because he did comment about could this be a dream, and the main reason he wondered is because he's had plenty of dreams of a similar nature. And certainly dreams do sometimes feel real. I've definitely had dreams that felt very real, so I can relate to that very much. But now we get to a completely different topic as I transition topics here, because we come to the question of what's happening literally when Data explains how he happens to be there in that room, because he says they reconstructed his mind and memories from a single neuron, and then they reconstructed